Cultivating Language Arts, Preschool through High School. And this talk kind of came into existence as a result of a conversation that I was having with one of my friend of mine who was a superintendent of a school district in Eastern Washington State. Very well-educated man, articulate, PhD. I knew he was smart, not because he was a PhD or a superintendent of a school district, but because he was homeschooling his own children, even though he was the superintendent of the school district. And we got into this conversation where somehow I said to him, I don't like the term language arts. I just don't like it. And you know, for a lot of us, it conjures up all sorts of kind of yucky stuff. You know, there's phonics, and then there's sight words, and then there's, of course, reading and reading comprehension, and then there's handwriting, and then there's spelling, and then there's grammar, and there's composition, and then there's, you know, public speaking and literary analysis, and the list goes on forever. And it's just so messy and complex and kind of ugly. I just said, I don't like the term. And then he said to me, well, that's because you don't know what they are. And I was a little taken aback when he said that, and I thought, okay, took a little humble pill and said, what are they? And he said to me, well, in a more classical sense, there are 4 of them, and they are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And the latter 2, reading and writing, are predicated or dependent upon the former 2. And one of our great problems in public schools is that we teach very energetically. We try to teach reading and writing, but we give short shrift to listening and speaking because we don't test them. We can assess reading and writing, but we can't easily assess listening and speaking. Consequently, we don't attend to the teaching of those. And that's when I knew this is a very, very insightful gentleman. So what I'd like to do with you tonight is talk a little bit about these 4 arts of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and about how they are very interdependent. And then I'd like to go through kind of rapid fire, if you will, things that you can do at each of 5 developmental levels to cultivate these 4 skills: preschool, primary, upper elementary, middle school, and high school. So one thing I don't like about PowerPoint presentations is that sometimes people feel like they have to somehow write down or screenshot or copy everything, and it just keeps going. And this will get to be kind of a fairly packed screen by the end. So I will be sure to send this PowerPoint to the Jason at HSOK, and then he can make it available to anyone who would like to see just the PowerPoint, maybe in slow motion. So let's think first about listening. It's an interesting word. In English, we have 2 similar words with kind of analogous, but not quite the same meaning. Listen and hear, hearing and listening. So these are slightly nuanced, aren't they? Hearing, everybody hears. You always hear. Unless you're deaf or seriously hearing impaired, you hear whether you want to or not. Hearing is somewhat random. It is whatever happens to be in the environment. Listening, on the other hand, to listen, it's more of a kind of active. It's a transitive type of verb. It needs an object. We listen to something. We listen for something. It has an intentionality about it. And so it can be, I would argue, a skill that can be cultivated. Also, you think about speaking. Speaking is another word for which we have a similar but not quite the same word. Again, in English, these parallel words: talk and speak. Talking, speaking. Well, everybody talks. Unless you have a severe language disability, everyone talks. But you just do it. However, speaking, again, a little more transitive, a little more intentional. You speak to someone, you speak about something. There's a nature to speaking that sounds more formal. It kind of formalizes. Now, when we think about listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and we think about the relationship between them, well, of course, first of all, we would say speaking is almost entirely dependent upon listening and hearing. It is very unlikely that anyone would say a word which they had not heard. So hearing and listening become foundational to talking and speaking. If you think about reading, what's the relationship here? Well, when you read something, you essentially are figuring out what it says and then listening to what you are hearing yourself say to yourself, right? So you see a word and you use your phonics and your word attack skills and your database of recognizable words and phonemes, and you try to figure out what that word is if you don't already recognize it. However, if you don't already know the word, it's very, very difficult to know what it is when you read it. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a child and you are reading along and you come across the word sleigh. So you use your phonics sound out skills and you say sligha, 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 sligha. There is no such thing as a sligha. So it must be something else. Through the process of elimination, you outrule that. Then you look at it some more and you say, E-I-G-H, that's that same letter pattern in the word eight. That must be A. So this word must be sleigh. And so you look at it, you use those skills, and you figure it out, and you say, ha, that word is sleigh. Now, it only works if you already know what a sleigh is. If you don't know what a sleigh is, if you have not heard that word and attached meaning to it, then it might as well be a sleighah. So our ability to decode and comprehend in reading is very much predicated upon the auditory vocabulary which we have acquired through listening, and our ability to sound out and speak and hear what we're saying to ourselves. That's how we learn to read, especially in the beginning. And of course, as we get older, things become faster and more automatic so that we lose the need of that process because we recognize almost all the words we see. And if we see one we don't recognize, we're usually old enough to say, okay, I will take the time to go and find that in a dictionary and figure out what it means, or I'll make a good educated guess. So the reading very dependent on the previously acquired vocabulary, primarily acquired through hearing and associating meaning with those words. Now, in our modern day, we don't see a whole lot of need for a sleigh in our daily life. Some who live perhaps in the northernmost places might possibly still have one. Our best chance to see a sleigh would be a fake sleigh with a fake Santa in a mall at Christmas, which is to be avoided at all costs, in my view. Or more likely, you could possibly see a movie in which there was a sleigh and someone used the word in context. Or most likely, it would be in a book that was read to a child. Perhaps it had pictures, perhaps it didn't, but by the context and the circumstance or the explanation of the person reading the book, that idea of sleigh and the concept of the idea of a sleigh would make it into the brain and be stored there. So, very important. Now, if we think about writing, writing is hugely dependent on listening and speaking as well. Because when you want to write something, what do you have to do? Well, first, you have to have an idea. The idea must pre-exist. If there is no idea, there is nothing to write and no writing can occur. So an idea must exist. That idea can pre-exist outside your mind, i.e., something that you read or heard, or that idea can exist inside your mind, i.e., something which you remember or can imagine. But the idea must pre-exist. Then, of course, that idea has to go into words. You have to almost speak that into existence. Now, if the idea pre-existed in words, say it was something that you read or something that you heard in words, it's not nearly as hard to recreate that idea by speaking it again, by retelling, re-speaking. If the idea was less concrete, if it was an imagination or a memory or a combination thereof, then it's not as easy, but the writer still must kind of speak it into existence. Then you speak that idea into existence and hear what you heard yourself say. So again, listening, it's a feedback loop. That's called knowing what you're thinking, hearing what you're thinking. So you have to speak it into existence, hear what you said yourself speak into existence, whether you did it with your vocal cords or without them, it's the same process. Then you have to remember what you heard yourself say to yourself, and then you've got to go rely on your ability to make letters and spell words and know some basic mechanics of writing in order to put those into the right sequence and transfer the idea from outside to the page or screen where you're reproducing it. It's insanely complex. In fact, the more I have been teaching writing, the more I am convinced that it's just proof for the existence of God. This ability could never possibly have evolved. It's too insanely complex. But this relationship between listening, speaking, reading, and writing is so fundamental that if we tend to listening and speaking appropriately, the teaching of reading and writing becomes so much easier. And that was what my friend at the Washington School District had pointed out to me. And ever since then, I have been enamored with this understanding, continuing to teach it and contemplate it, so much so that it became the tagline for our company. If you take a look in the corner, you see IEW right below in little tiny words. It says, listen, speak, read, write, and think, which of course is the result. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about preschool and what can you do with very young children to cultivate these skills. I would say first, and this is maybe a little bit ironic, but the most important thing is music. Music, and by association, stories, that children are listening to music and stories. Now, music is a bridge between the world of vibration and the world of language. I have a 2-hour presentation called The Profound Effects of Music on Life. It's a very, very good talk, and I wish everyone in the world could hear it. You can get it off our website if you're so inclined, iew.com. But I do spend a good amount of time there explaining how music is really a bridge between the gross world of vibration and the more refined world of language, because language at its core is simply different tones. Short tones, long tones, harsh tones, soft tones, tones that go up, tones that go down, different accent on tones. If you hear a language that you don't know, of course, you're not really hearing words because you don't know. You're hearing tones. And then through repeated exposure to those tones, then you start to identify meanings that go with those tonal combinations, and that becomes words. So for children, music is very, very, very important. And of course, simple songs that they can sing and listen to. I would also strongly recommend that you embark on a focused listening program with young children. Unfortunately, in today's world, music is much more random. We kind of hear it. We might hear it on the radio. We might hear it if we're in a store. We might hear it, unfortunately, at the gas station if we're just trying to fill up the car and there's stupid screen on. It's almost like everywhere you go, you're just hearing music, most of which you really don't want to hear. And it's very random for children, and it's a very different musical environment that existed, 100, 150 years ago. But we can use recorded music to the benefit of children, and one way to do that is focused listening. Now, what you would do when you start on this is you would find a short selection, just a couple minutes, of a great piece of music. And you don't have to know much about music. All you need to know is a few names like Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Handel. If you know those, right, then all you have to do is YouTube up or do a search, best hits of Bach. Start right there and just grab 2 or 3 minutes of something that strikes you as beautiful and engaging, and then play the same 3 minutes for the child or children, if you have multiple children, each day, maybe a couple times each day, and encourage them while you're doing this to do nothing, to just listen, maybe even just close their eyes and keep it short so you can cultivate this attentiveness, which is really at the core of the listening skill, is it not? We very often say to people, pay attention, listen. What we want them to do is focus in, eliminate distraction, and this is a teachable, learnable skill. And it happens first with music. So you could even do, kind of a couple months on one composer, just 3 minutes of Bach, same piece of music every day for a week, 6 or 7 days. And then the next week, maybe the next 3 minutes or a different few minutes of a different piece by the same composer. You could have Bach month or two and just short little focused listening segments. And I'll tell you what happens is every time the child hears it, they will love it more. Just like a good story. A classic piece of music is very much like a classic story. What do children always say when they want you to read them the book that you already read them very recently? Read it again. Well, I just read it to you. I know, but just read it again. Why? Because every time you read it, there's a familiarity that grows, there's an anticipation, there's an appreciation, especially if the language is beautiful and the story has value. And so music and stories for young children is actually at the foundation of everything you're going to ever do in language arts. It is, of course, perfectly fine for young children to overhear conversations. It's funny, with our oldest children, we tend to, talk to them at a level that perhaps we assume they would understand or hope to understand, not too far above. But once we have several children, younger children are in an environment where everybody's talking way over, and yet that's not a problem at all. It is perfectly fine, as long as the content is appropriate, for a 3 or 4-year-old to hear a conversation between an adult and a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old, right? Because that's how they get pulled up and it builds little by little, that database of language. Also very important, really at all ages, but most particularly in the preschool and primary ages, and that is minimize technology. There is a huge amount of research to show that as children are hyper-stimulated visually with screens, it reduces their imaginative capacity. They become dependent on the visual image. They are much less able to listen and attend to purely auditory information. And too much of what is available for young children actually is not necessarily going to qualify as beautiful or good, or in many cases even true. So you want to minimize the effect of especially screen-based technologies in the lives of young children. And it's very sad today, even at a homeschool convention, I may go and see a family and there's, a 3 or 4-year-old in a stroller, with an iPad, a phone, being entertained by a cartoon. Even if it's not a bad cartoon, the problem is they're highly addictive, they're visually hyperstimulating, and it reduces the child's ability to be tuned into the auditory information in the world around him. Of course, preschool children love to learn simple poems and songs. Sadly, we've kind of lost the nursery rhyme culture. It used to be that most parents would naturally teach nursery rhymes to their children. They would maybe have a book of nursery rhymes. In fact, I was at one of my daughter's homes, and she has a a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old, and she had on her shelf a childcraft volume of nursery rhymes and poems for very young children. And this is published back in like 1970 or something when I was 10 years old. And I just out and I started reading many of these, which I had known as a child, and I thought, how delightful. The simple imagery, simple meter, the delightful rhyme schemes, they're so engaging. And, children of all ages, everyone from the 2-year-old to the 7-year-old enjoyed these simple poems. And then, of course, as children get older, you continue with poetry at a higher level. It is also noticeable that young children will talk to themselves quite a lot. In fact, this is, by the way, one of the great, maybe the only great thing about getting old, grandchildren, because you can observe them in a whole new view. You have the decades of the wisdom and experience gained through raising children, and now you can interact with, play with, observe, further your understanding of children with your grandchildren. And then, of course, if they become irksome, you just send them away. Go to your mother, goodbye, and life is good again. But children left on their own very often will talk to themselves. And sometimes, even into age 8, 9, 10, and if we send them to an environment like a kindergarten class or first grade, and the basic rule is sit down, be quiet, and only speak when you have permission, this is a horrible language development environment because it's extremely important that children talk to themselves. That's how they hear what they're thinking. They talk to themselves so that they can hear what they are thinking. Then, of course, they hit a point of age where they realize that it's not really socially appropriate to be talking to yourself, especially when other people are around. And so we tend to stop doing it at a certain age. And then when you hit another certain later age, you may start talking to yourself again. And that's because you're on the other side of the neurological arc, and you need to say stuff so that you can know what you're thinking, or say stuff so you will remember what you thought. But it's very important that children have the freedom to do this. It's developmentally critical. And again, when they're in an environment that is stifled, it is, I believe, can be very harmful. And of course, part of all of that, poems and songs and talking to self, is the developing of imagination. And oftentimes children will tell you stories that are just not true, and they're not true, but the child tells them as if they were true, and they really happen, because in their mind, this cultivating imagination, they're seeing things that can be as powerful in their imagination as things that are real and exist outside their imagination. Although there's quite a bit of research into memory to show that many of the things that we remember, we do not remember them as other people do or as they actually happened. And sometimes we remember things that didn't actually happen. And so memory is very inviolable. But it's critical for children to develop this imagination and then speaking ideas into existence, because that's going to be at the core of composition later on. Of course, children, they don't read with their eyes yet, but they do read with their ears. And so you can be reading them. They love picture books because the picture creates the context so that they can actually make inferences from what they're listening to. And they like to point out to you the things they hear, and they see them on that page. And so think about that. Children are reading with their ears. And in fact, they read with their ears at a much higher level than they are going to read when they start to decode words and read with their eyes. It is also appropriate to overhear conversations between older people. It is perfectly okay for them to overhear higher level books. So you can read to the whole family and the 3-year-olds in the room, and it really doesn't matter whether they understand it or not. They'll understand something. They'll become familiar with words. The older children, probably more engaged. And so you don't have to worry about that, of course. Writing, children will start to want to pick up a utensil, sometimes as young as 2 something. So you almost always by 4, there's this desire to imitate people, imitate parents and older siblings who are using utensils to make marks on paper. And probably one of the most important things I think is as a child wants to start to draw, it's worth taking the time to repeatedly show them how to hold the crayon or the marker or the pencil correctly. Because if you can get that set at the fairly young age, then it's not so hard. If you can't, or if you ignore that, then you get children who have all sorts of weird ways of holding a utensil, and that becomes much more problematic later on. Also, with preschool children, they will often experiment with both hands. So they may try to write something with one hand and then switch and try to do it with another. This is not anything to be worried about. It's also not an indication that this is a genius child who's going to be ambidextrous. It means they're sorting out their laterality, and generally, later on, most likely by 5 or 6, the handedness will be firmly in place. And that's good. If not, then something to look at. So a lot of things to consider in constructing the environment for the development of the arts of language for preschool age children. Spelling, yes. It's interesting. Children can actually learn to spell words before they can learn to read them. In fact, I would guess that in many homes, one of the first words that children learn how to spell is ice. Because someone says, hey, do we have any ICECREM? And it doesn't take very long for that child to put the ICE with the thing that they would love to have. And so you can actually work with letter sounds and a bit of the phonemic awareness of sounds and spelling out simple words just auditorily even before they're going to read or write those. So I think, sometimes parents think they'll speak in code, and what happens is they end up accidentally teaching their children some spelling words. So you can do that intentionally as well. All right, let's move on and talk about the primary grades. This, of course, would be what we would normally consider children in the 5 to 7-year-old range, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. Again, you're looking at music and stories. Continue and expand, if possible, that focused listening into more minutes of maybe eyes closed, just listening, doing nothing. And when you finish, give them a chance to try and articulate back anything that they noticed or heard while they were listening. Did you imagine anything? Did you notice anything? Did you like any moment better than any other? Did you see anything? And so that's very, very helpful. And of course, you focus on the few great composers and the best of the best. So, the greatest hits of, and honestly, if you know the name of the composer, that's good enough. You don't need a whole, music appreciation curriculum there. Primary children love picture stories. They also start to enjoy books without pictures. And this is where you would increase the attention span on all of these things. And usually by the age of 6 or 7, you discover that you can read appropriate chapter books to children. Although they always want to see the picture, they can often enjoy without the picture. And with the exception of audiobooks, which don't really count in terms of the evils of screen-based technology. Again, you want to minimize the technology and use it in a very focused and useful way. But if you ever sense that, the children are craving or becoming seemingly addicted to having screens as a distraction or a primary form of entertainment, you really want to work on minimizing that. Audiobooks, on the other hand, are technology redeemed because that's where you can put, good stories and books into the imagination without the imagination being robbed through the screen. With speaking, of course, children can continue with nursery rhymes, but expand probably into longer poems. If you come from a tradition where memorized prayers are a part of your religious culture, scripture, memory work. These can be done fantastically well in this age range. Children have this absorbent mind, as Maria Montessori called it. It's interesting. I've had people buy one of our programs, which is a poetry memorization program that I'll mention later, and I'm sure Laura will tell you about, for a fourth grader, and discover that fourth grader's younger sibling, who's 5, is memorizing the poems just as easily or even more easily than the 10-year-old. And so this is a great time to furnish the mind, to build up the stock of vocabulary and beautiful language and imagery, and do it in an intentional, systematic way. So you learn a poem, and then you keep reciting that poem every day, and you learn another poem, and then you recite both poems you've learned every day, and you learn another poem, and you recite all the poems you've learned every day, so that you maintain the memorized repertoire. And that's where you start to see the cumulative and superpower of language memorization. Charlotte Mason, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her books on home education. She talked about narration as a good habit. What it is when you give a child an opportunity to tell back what they have experienced, heard, done. If you make cookies with a child after the cookies are in the oven, sit down for a minute and, cuddle up and say, so, how do we make those cookies? What do we do first? What do we do next? What do we do next? What do we do next? And try to have the child move through time. Narration kind of means moving through time as you describe something. Go for a nature walk, come back, take a few minutes and say, so, who remembers, what do we see on our nature walk? What are some of the things we say? Now, they may not get it in right order. In fact, they're most likely to go in this order. Most interesting thing first, then probably one of the last things that happened because it's most recent. And then, there was another thing we did at the beginning, and there was this other very interesting thing. So they may not get all the things in the right sequence per se, but in doing so, they start to learn that organization of events and sequences and processes. When you read them a story, you can stop and give them a chance to narrate back what happened. What did you just hear in this story or in this chapter of this book? It's very, very powerful. I could talk a lot about how I've seen that as a way to really build kind of not just the verbal fluency, but also the attentiveness to detail. When it becomes a habit of noticing and communicating details, then the ability to notice and communicating details improves. So you can read a bit about that on the Charlotte Mason website, or get her actual books if you'd like to, or just take the idea and try it out. And this is also a time when children start to enjoy dictating stories to you. This would essentially be, they dictate a story and you write it down for them. So they get actually kind of the experience of writing something by dictating it. One of my grandsons would give me presents very often, certainly on my birthday, Christmas, Father's Day, and sometimes just because. And most of the time, the present he would give me was a book that was written and illustrated by him. Only he didn't necessarily write all the words on paper when he was, 5. He would dictate the story, his mother would write the words, and then he would draw pictures to illustrate the story. And it was pretty much the same story each time. Once upon a time, there was a knight, and there was also a horrible dragon that was making all the people suffer horribly. And so the knight went out, and then he killed the dragon, and it was a mighty victory. And then he came back to the king, and the king was so happy that he said, "You can marry the princess." And he married the princess, and they lived happily ever after. So basically, that story in many different iterations, but how delightful. Now, in primary grades, of course, you start looking at teaching phonics for decoding. There are many programs out there for this. English phonics, as we understand it, is basically what was originally kind of organized and presented by Orton Gillingham, and there are many people who have done things with this. Sing, Spell, Read, and Write was kind of a fun one we used when our children were young. I'm very unhappy with how they've jazzed up the music, and it's no longer acceptable to me. There's, of course, some programs like Writing Road to Reading, Spell to Read and Write, Logic of English. And then, of course, we have one which we like called the Primary Arts of Language Reading. And so whatever you use, I think there's two elements. One is it needs to be organized so that you do it in a fashion that it's step by step, not too much all at once. And it has to have some elements that capture the imagination. So if you end up with something that's looking a little bit dry, like 100 easy lessons to learn to read, you, the teacher, you, the teaching parent, you may have to spice it up with some imaginative stories or illustrations or something. We've tried to make ours as enjoyable for children as possible, although I don't like things that are too cutesy. So you can take a look at that if you're interested, but this is a good time. And again, children will generally show you when they are interested in learning to decode with letters and words. They will try. And if they're trying, then that indicates there's a readiness there. If they're not interested, one of the worst things you can do is try to teach a child to read before they're neurologically ready. In fact, I fear that we do a huge disservice to millions of children in this country by forcing them to try and read, at an age before they're ready. I mean, once upon a time, there wasn't an attempt to teach children reading in kindergarten. Now there's actually pre-K reading curriculums, which is even more absurd. Some countries that get much better results from their schools than we do actually don't force formal reading until sometimes 8 years old. And you'll also notice, if you have boys and girls, that the average girl is a year or two ahead of the average boy when it comes to reading and writing on paper aptitude. So don't push it. It's actually better to start a little bit too late and have it be an easy path and have them enjoy it than to start too early, have them be frustrated and hate it, and then decide they don't want to do it, and then it's just a battle. And and I have a child, and some of you may have heard my story about my only boy of the 7, number 6 in the lineup. He was extremely dyslexic. He did not read a book until he was 12 years old. He didn't really read anything independently until he was 11. But he did use a lot of audiobooks. In fact, in a way, he actually is more well-read than any of his sisters, even the ones who were reading Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at 6 years old, because he spent pretty much 5 or 6 years of his first, kindergarten through about 5th or 6th grade. He really didn't do much at all except play with Legos, climb trees, build forts, do chores, do auditory math and spelling, and listen to audiobooks 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a day. And what's really interesting is that he had this huge database of good and great literature, so that when he did start to read, he could read almost anything right off. He went from 0 to 60 overnight. And when he started to write really fluently around age 14, his prose was by far more sophisticated and elegant than any of his siblings at that age. So if you do have a child who isn't taking to the reading thing quickly, then introduce the idea of literature by way of audiobooks, and don't be afraid to continue with that. When students are interested in writing, they will, again, be showing you this. And one of the important things from my perspective is attend to correct letter formation, stroke order. You know how you used to have those little strips, and it would have a letter, and it would have a little number 1 and an arrow, and then a number 2 and an arrow, and it would tell you what to do first, what to do. That's very important because it contributes to ease of handwriting and legibility. It helps decrease the problem of reversal letters with dyslexia. So it's more of a consistent kinesthetic experience. If you allow a child to just kind of copy a letter and make it however they want to, and it's not consistent, then you can get some real aberrations in the way they do that, which will be a burden later on. So try to attend to the correct letter formation as much as possible. And then, of course, as they're doing that, you would start simple copy work, grade 1, 2. In fact, in my view, the most important thing that children do to learn to write well from an early age, or to write well, is from the earlier age, and continuing on even in elementary school, is just copying, proverbs, copying sentences, copying poems, copying, a paragraph from a story, a little bit, not too much. You don't want to exhaust the child. Unfortunately, this idea of copy work has been thrown out of the modern progressive education kind of baby with the bathwater. But there's tremendous value. It builds stamina, it builds attention to detail, it builds confidence, and children don't mind it. They're actually wired for imitation that includes memorization and copy work. And then, of course, you would probably introduce a spelling program of some sort. You can continue with verbal and auditory spelling, which is really a great reinforcement. I remember my mother had the habit of just, drilling me before the word drill was evil. I never thought drill was a bad thing. She would practice with me my spelling lists from school, when we were in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, or driving in the car, or sitting around. She would just run spelling words, and I would try to spell them verbally. And so that was very helpful. And then, of course, eventually you also want to be doing a written spelling program. We provide All About Spelling Level 1 with our primary arts of language program. We also sell All About Spelling Level 2 and 3 as a convenience to our customers. And then we have a spelling program called the Phonetic Zoo, which is more of an auditory-based listen and spell and listen and write, listen and write, listen and write type of program. And Laura can tell you about that later if you have any questions. Now, with older children, this is where we move into kind of my favorite grades, because they're old enough to be smart and young enough to be playful and sweet. This is a time when you can encourage them to not just listen to something, but also narrate it back. If you go to a church where they need to listen, say, to a sermon each week, or you could find some recorded stories or sermons, and then with the intention, letting them know you're going to listen to this so that you can tell me what you heard. And so then they start to think, okay, I got to see not just what am I hearing, but what can I remember from what I hear. And you, of course, increase the attention span through this, and as much as possible, continue minimizing screen-based amusements, screen-based. I'm not even usually a favor of educational programs that are screen-based if what they have is, again, that super visual stimulation. Of course, we learn well often when we see and hear things together. So online classes where a teacher can teach and show certain like documentary films are good. But I think you understand the point I've made about the effect of technology on young children. With speaking, you can continue narration, and this is an age when you can actually get into what I would say more formal recitation, where they not only have memorized a poem, but they have opportunity to present this poem to someone. Perhaps you have a little homeschool group or a few families you can get together once a month, have a little poetry recitation party. Everyone practices up their favorite poems or two, and then you can, play popcorn and eat popcorn and play ultimate frisbee. I had one beautiful story. A woman came to one of my seminars and said, well, my son is halfway through your poetry memorization level 3, which means he had memorized and probably could recite on demand around 50 poems if he's halfway through level 3. And she said his favorite thing to do is to go to the assisted care facilities and retirement homes and recite poetry for the residents there. And I just thought, how sweet. And all these poems in my program are old anyway, because they're all public domain, because I didn't want to pay royalties to anybody. And these are the same poems that these old people probably had learned in school 70, 80 years ago. This is also a time when children can become interested in not just formal recitation opportunities, but drama. I have had almost all my children have been involved in drama. When we were living in California for a decade, we formed a homeschool theater group and did a play every year for, 6-7 years. It was a tremendous amount of work, but it was so worth it. And just the discipline of memorizing those lines and practicing them again and again, and then, being on stage and learning how to act and say lines and control your body and your mouth and everything else, tremendously valuable. And then even speech contests, if you have an opportunity to get involved, I think children grade 3 to 5 respond quite well to that type of thing. For the most part, they may be on the shy side, but with reading, of course, you continue audiobooks, you continue reading out loud to them at a level above their own decoding skills, because that is what actually increases comprehension. And one idea is for them to do oral reading. But to whom? Well, one trick I pulled was when my son, when he started to read around 12 years old, I said, okay, look, we'll make a deal. You do the dishes because it's your job tonight, and I'll read to you. Or if you prefer, I'll do the dishes and you read to me. What do you like? Well, he'd almost always go for the latter, of course. And then I would do the dishes very slowly to milk it for all it was worth. But the ability to read out loud is a wonderful skill to take into life. And one other thing that we did for a while, especially with the older kids, worked quite well, was on the homeschool checklist, it said, read to a younger sibling 20 minutes. So every day, one of the older kids had to read to one of the younger kids for at least 20 minutes. And that would get 2 kids out of mom's hair for at least 20 minutes. And it worked until the 2 youngest. And then, of course, my 9-year-old son couldn't read anything, and his 6-year-old sister could read anything, and you couldn't really say read to your older brother. So that didn't fly. But to the degree you can encourage children to have an opportunity to do oral reading, this will pay off well later in life. Again, this is the perfect time to begin composition, and as well as I do, the best possible way to teach writing is with structure and style, and Laura will explain all about how that system works after I finish here, in case you are not aware. But we do have a tremendously effective program for teaching composition, and that is such a sweet spot right there, elementary level A. Again, you would continue with your spelling program, and I think right around grade 4-5, you can begin to teach analytical grammar. We have a good program called Fix It Grammar, which we would recommend book 1, Nose Tree, at about grade 4. Also, I think that around grade 4-5 is a wonderful time to start Latin. Latin has so many benefits. The first of being, it helps expand English vocabulary. It helps with English spelling. The second, of course, is that Latin is a language you don't know, so now you need to learn grammar. What are those things called, and what are the rules that govern their behavior? And I would say most people would learn more English grammar from studying Latin than they ever would from studying English grammar. So middle school, of course, we're going a little faster here. This is when listening can be accompanied by note-taking. And if you use our writing system, you will understand the idea of keyword outlines. And so students can take notes in keywords. Again, if they go to a conference, if they, weekly go and listen to a sermon, appropriate talk on YouTube, or even a lecture that you may devise to give them, and they can practice note-taking using keyword outlines. This is a tremendously valuable skill. So many students, they get out of high school without really having any good training in how to take notes effectively. And continuing with audiobooks, very, very valuable. In fact, you can listen to audiobooks your whole life. I listen to audiobooks all the time. In fact, there is never a time when I don't have at least one audiobook going, in addition to one or two books that I'm reading with my eyes. So audiobooks are one of the greatest blessings. Here, if you're into poetry, you can expand the idea into famous speeches. When we redid our poetry program years ago, we added level 5, and that was excerpts from famous speeches. And I will tell you, there is nothing that puts you at a moment in history more effectively than learning a short excerpt from a speech given by a person at that time in history. I remember recording Queen Elizabeth I's speech to her troops as they headed off to fight the Spanish Armada against all odds but to defend England. And it was a very short little speech, but you just felt like you were there. And the impact, the historical benefit is so good. So excerpts from famous speeches are very good. Children this age very often get excited about competition, contests. 4-H, many of you may be familiar with that. It's strong. I think also we have Future Farmers of America and a couple other organizations like that. NHD stands for National History Day. This is a contest that involves essay writing or speech giving or website designing or movie making or dramatic presentations. So speech contests can be very motivating to students, and even having a little opportunity for impromptu speaking. Also, you can get involved with debate. The NCFCA, which is the National Christian Forensics and Communication Association. It's one of the two debate leagues. The other one is STOA. They're both great, and you can compete, I believe, if you're 12 years old on January 1st. But a lot of clubs have opportunity for children younger to do juniors types of things. And so working with a little bit of impromptu public speaking and debate, very, very good. If you're in a classical conversation group, you have an opportunity, I think it's challenge 1, to do debate. With reading, you want to try and encourage the student more towards some of the classics. What is a classic? It's a book that has stood the test of time. It's a book you can read again and again and get more out of each time. I have personally tried to follow and tried to, as much as possible, enforce from my students C.S. Lewis's rule, which I've heard different versions of this rule, so I cannot tell you which one is the true rule of C.S. Lewis, but the one I followed was the one that says you should read one old book for every new book. That way you stay in touch with the older books and read things that may be a little bit stiff, not quite as catchy, but have perhaps greater or lasting value. And so I tried this. And definition of old is if the author is dead. So, a new book, the author is still living, writing more books for you to buy. The old book, the author is dead, and so it's old enough. And a continuing oral reading out loud. I think, again, take that idea of going into assisted care facility, a middle school, 12, 13-year-old child could go in and read to some of the old folks there. They would probably greatly appreciate it. Middle school is when you want to really do lots of writing and, if possible, enter some contests. We have a contest every year at IEW. There are so many. Veterans of Foreign Wars, Daughters of the American Revolution. There's several different pro-life writing contests. Sometimes state organizations have them. I don't know if Homeschool Oklahoma has, but I should encourage them to do a writing contest, maybe something on Oklahoma history or something. Children are very motivated by that. Continuing grammar, Latin, and of course introducing the study of logic, which we would more likely associate with, some obscure thing like philosophy, or we might think of it as a subset of math. But really, the study of logic is the glue of the corpus callosum that holds your hemispheres together. And so as you may know, you look at the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, the quadrivium. The trivium is grammar and logic and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium are the mathematical arts of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So do embark on a study of logic. And there's lots of publishers out there. One of my favorites is Classical Academic Press. They have a course called Argument Builder and the Art of Argument. Both are very good and enjoyable. High school, and we'll just zip through this. This is really a time of integration. This is when the 4 arts of language all come together. You're listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking in order to, again, compete in speech and debate, mock trial, be in contests. You want to move into, if you want to move into a kind of a classical approach to your homeschooling, then look at facilitating some Socratic discussions with groups of teenagers. Maybe take a course in rhetoric, or better yet, continue with IEW's high school level C writing program. Drama, musical theater, if it's possible. Declamation is essentially when you memorize a famous speech that someone gave, not an excerpt, but the whole thing, and then you stand up and you give that speech from memory as if you were that person. So it's a little bit of acting, tremendous amount of memory, and a great furnishing of the mind with vocabulary and syntax and schemes and tropes and seminal ideas. I do think a lot of high school students can do very well in college classes. We have great opportunities in Oklahoma for dual enrollment or online classes. Liberty University has online classes that lots and lots of high school age students take. I know at least a dozen that I have personally met, homeschool kids who actually started when they were 15 or 16, took college classes, and were able to finish, quote, high school and get an Associates of Arts degree, and thereby save themselves a couple years of expensive tuition. So, and the other great thing about doing it in high school is if you go to the community college and you get a bad teacher, just drop the class, you don't lose anything. Go off to a university, you can't really afford to drop the class because, that costs you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. So community involvement, internships, political campaigns are great for kids, really causes them to grow up and integrate all those language arts very quickly. Of course, volunteer opportunity, missions trips, these are all wonderful things for students to do. I know I had contact for a while with a girl in Texas. She worked on the political campaign for a state representative from her district in Texas. And when she was 16, and he was so impressed with her, he was elected, and he then hired her, as an intern to maintain kind of the communications on his website. Not that she did all the design and technical work, but she was in charge of getting the content and getting it edited, and she had a tremendous experience doing that. I think it is very, very good for teenagers to teach classes for younger children. You've got a 15, 16-year-old child who's learned language arts well, has used our writing program for 3 or 4 years. There's absolutely no reason that person could not go and teach a class of, say, half a dozen 9, 10-year-old children, whatever they want to teach. And then, of course, starting a business is another great way to see the integration of skills. And we have some materials to help with all of these. If you take a look at our catalog, you will see. A few to highlight: we have our linguistic development through poetry memorization. As I mentioned, that's a wonderful program for children of all ages to furnish their mind with beautiful and enjoyable and sometimes humorous poetry. Our primary arts of language for reading and writing. This is our K-1-2 beginning program. We have our teaching, writing, structure, and style, which is a course for you to learn our whole syllabus, our whole method. And then with that, you can either go into theme-based writing lessons, or if you like, you can take a look at our structure and style for students course. And I do hope you will watch the little promo video. You can watch it on YouTube. You can also watch it on our website, idib.com/SSS. The kids are so cute, and this is the very studio I am in right now where we recorded this over a period of 2 years' time. So great course. We have free lessons. If you hadn't heard about this, idw.com/lessons2020. This is 3 weeks of lessons that are for including 3 video courses from Structure and Style for students, 3 weeks of our Fix-It Grammar, vocabulary and literature, as well as level 1 of our poetry memorization. So you don't even have to buy anything to get going with the IEW approach to cultivating language arts. Lastly, if you are not tired of hearing me talk already and you want to hear more, I have a weekly podcast that I do with my cohort, Julia Walker, and you can find that on all the major podcast platforms. It's called the Arts of Language Podcast.